Hello and welcome. My name is Meepolis, they, he, she, and today we're looking at and talking about A Contract with God, a novel by Will Eisner, a collection of short stories. It is the first graphic novel in the trilogy of the same name, followed by A Life Force and Dropsie Avenue, The Neighborhood, originally published in 1978. Content notes for nudity, abuse, alcoholism, anti-Semitism, manipulation, misogyny, and sex, with things getting a lot darker than I remembered, including the heterosexuals, sexualizing children, adultery, and rape. Clicking over to his Wikipedia page, quote, William Irwin Eisner, March 6, 1917 to January 3, 2005, was an American cartoonist, writer, and entrepreneur. He was one of the earliest cartoonists to work in the American comic book industry, and his series The Spirit, 1940 to 1952, was noted for its experiments in content and form. In 1978, he popularized the term graphic novel with the publication of his book, A Contract with God. He was an early contributor to formal comic studies with his book, Comic and Sequential Art, 1985. The Eisner Award was named in his honor and is given to recognize achievements each year in the comics medium. He was one of the 3 inaugural inductees to the Will Eisner Comic Book Hall of Fame. End quote. Keywords that came to mind reading this volume were grief, poverty, marriage, family, loneliness, vacation, and the arts. The content and plot summaries section on the Wikipedia opens like this. Quote, A Contract with God mixes melodrama with social realism. Following an author's introduction, a tenement in the Bronx, the book contains 4 stories set in a tenement building. They derive in part from Eisner's personal memories growing up in a tenement in the Bronx. With A Contract with God, he aimed to explore an area of Jewish American history that he felt was underdocumented, while showing that comics was capable of mature literary expression, at a time when it received little such regard as an artistic medium. In the preface, he stated his aim to keep the exaggeration in his cartooning within realistic limits. The story, A Contract with God, drew from Eisner's feelings of the death at 16 of his daughter Alice. In his introduction to the 2006 edition of the book, Eisner first wrote about it, and the feelings he felt towards God were reflected in the story. The street singer and the super are fictional, but sprang from Eisner's memories of people he had met in the tenement of his youth. Crookeline was the most autobiographical. The main character, Willie, even carries Eisner's own boyhood nickname. Eisner remarked that it took a lot of determination, a kind of courage, to write that story. The story's sexual content is prominent, though not in the gratuitous manner of underground comics, a celebration of hedonism, which contrasted with the conservative lifestyle of Eisner, the middle-aged businessman. Eisner used no profanity in the book, and according to critic Josh Lambert, the sex in Contract is not so much erotic as disturbing. The characters frustrated or filled with guilt. End quote. I originally picked this trilogy up in university for a class, and part of it had really stuck with me. The art, for one, is one of the styles that really tickles my brain, and I found the premise of focusing in on a block of New York City throughout its history extremely interesting, and probably the only reason I'm going to continue with this reread. The revisiting A Contract with God was certainly less edifying than I had recalled, thanks to the misogynistic directions the plot went in that I had apparently blocked out. Although I am glad to not just be recklessly recommending people read it right, left, and center anymore as a result. Not that it is to say no one should read these books. I can see the comments writing themselves as I speak. But as I try to always say, no book is actually a must-read, and no matter how good any book reportedly is, readers should have the chance to know about content that they might want to avoid for any number of reasons. So I'm glad I can better act in alignment with this value going forward instead of inadvertently being a hypocrite. But diving back into the thick of things, perhaps unsurprisingly, the Wikipedia page for this volume is pretty lengthy and pretty in-depth, gathering together the largely positive analysis of this formative text. Combined with the introduction to this W.W. Norton and Company reprint for a book published well before my birth, I did feel like I got a lot of the context of Eisner's intent in putting his pen to paper and the personal resonance he felt with these stories. There's a lot of horrible people in this world, and talking about that, while not something everyone has to read at any given point in time, is an important part of life. I also think it's completely justified for people to pick up this book and feel like it is incredibly misogynistic misogynistic. I can't speak for all the commenters who point this out, but for me, this did not tie back to the dark themes of the collection. It also did not tie back to the presence of people hurting other people via sex. The issue for me is that 95% of the book, these women folk be either young, nubile, unattached, or old, cronish, married. The stories lean into the old ball and chain trope. They chase after money, and if they have sexual appeal, they are going to use it to ends that the book does not seem to approve of. Of course, the worst point in this collection was the story Super, in which, according to the Wikipedia page, we are supposed to think of the young girl as a hero who brings down an anti-Semitic building manager, which is certainly not the interpretation that first sprang to my mind. I mean, good on Eisner for trying to tackle his own trauma of being used as an adolescent by a much older woman. These kinds of stories are still pretty thin on the ground, and it's still impossible for some people to grasp that this is not a good thing. But the contrast between how his self-insert was treated as opposed to Rosie in the Super was pretty stark. It certainly does not help at all that every man's problem basically boils down to women in his life. That said, I think one of the main reasons that aspects of the collection did not stand out to me more the first time through is because even as a young adult in university, I was eyeballs deep in the very binary cis heteronormative sexual ethic of white patriarchal evangelicalism. Of course, all these bad people were doing horrible things to each other because any sex outside of cis male, cis female, missionary married coitus was of the devil. Honestly, everything women did was of the devil. Overall, you will not be surprised at this point to hear that I found the gender and sexuality represented to be strictly binary and straight in as far as actions presented go. All for the best, as Eisner is not filling me with a lot of confidence that he can do justice to people not exactly like what he appears to be. Class was perhaps the most interesting intersection explored throughout the text. It is rare that I get the chance to read a comic book that largely centers poor people. Moving into race/ethnicity/culture, as far as this volume went, we get a taste of the way that Eisner's Jewishness and anti-Semitism are fairly central to many of his stories. I certainly appreciate that representation. The one note I would add to is that, as I will likely never be reviewing his series The Spirit, Eisner's track record on representing other non-white races is much more checkered, to say the least. Case in point, the character Ebony White, which is, it seems, no matter how he tried to defend it, exactly like a racist caricature of a black person based on minstrelsy. As usual, disability/ability were pretty one note, with people either being dead or fully able-bodied. Bye, y'all. Keep reading and organized to end capitalist oppression. And as always, Literally Graphic is created on land that should be given back to the traditional landholders, which in this case is, to my knowledge, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, non-Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation.